Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Peter Llewellyn. For those of you that know me, I run the services at medcommsnetwork.com, medcommsnetworking.com, and the associated websites, services, information resources, activities for the global MedComms community, by which I mean people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and so on. You'll find all sorts of activities there. And importantly, you'll find we do a lot of these webinars and we record them, we put them on NetworkPharma TV. So if you go to NetworkPharma TV, you'll find there's now about 400 videos. A lot of them are recordings of webinars like this. So there's a lot of very good content there and lots of interesting people to make connections with if you want to follow up what they've been talking about on the webinars. Today, absolutely delighted to have Len and Ilan with us, and we're going to talk about medical societies, conferences, and so on, which is all very important to those of us who work in and around MedComms. I will say, Len, you and I have done a couple of these webinars over the last couple of years, talking about what's going on, trying to predict what's happening in the future. So people might want to go back and look at what you said a year ago. But today we're going to sort of like take what's happening today, what happened last year, what are we thinking is happening next year. And Ilan, thank you very much for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself as well. But Ilan, you'll talk about the sort of what you're seeing running GMed and the platform you've got for peer-to-peer physician contacts and so on, and what you're seeing in terms of physician behavior. But let's start with Len. Just paint the picture. What are you seeing in the medical societies, the conferences, and the sort of trends you're seeing, Len?
Okay, well, thanks, Peter. It was indeed a year ago, almost a year ago to the day, where I presented what I had learned after the first year of disrupted medical conferences, where everything was virtual, but things were in flux, and we didn't really know exactly what was going to be permanent or not. Now, after 2 years of almost exclusively virtual events, I think we can really see where things are going, and we're moving into a new normal. So what I want to do is just present what I think are the 6 key learnings from the last 2 years, and maybe from that make a few comments about what these learnings might mean for the likes of medical societies, but also for anyone, any organizer of a medical conference. And then we can, maybe at this time, we can look at what the future might hold for us. So these 6 points, these 6 learnings, I'm just going to go through them briefly without going into great depth about what they really mean. So, and they're in no particular order of importance. They're more in the way that I have discovered them, and perhaps people out there have discovered them too. So the first one, I think, is maybe the most obvious and the one that was reported the most frequently, was just this dramatic increase in the number of attendees who are attending virtual conferences. Nearly all the medical societies mentioned this right at the beginning, and even the first Twitter feeds around conferences. I remember one of the early Twitter feeds from ASCO, they mentioned that right away. And the increases are really quite startling. I mean, they range from anything like 50% right up to almost 200%. I mean, this is very, very significant increases. And the other thing that I think is really important is we've seen a lot more doctors able to attend conferences from low to middle income countries. And this is likely to stay the case as we move into a new era of hybrid or online and face-to-face events. So this is going to be with us. So I think that's going to be having a major impact. The other thing that's now crystallized after a couple of years is that doctors really want a choice. What we've seen is doctors have been exposed, they've been forced to attend virtual conferences, and what they discovered is they're not as bad as they used to think. I mean, doctors before all said they preferred to go and wanted to go to in-person events, but they discovered that the virtual experience is really not that bad. Of course, there was a lot of criticism about not being able to network, but there were a lot of plus points as well. And one of the things that struck me was that many doctors said basically the learning experience was as good as or better than that in a face-to-face meeting, and I think that's really very very significant. And what we've got now from a number of studies and a number of surveys, one of which was conducted by Ilan here at GMed, was we're seeing that roughly less than 50% of doctors are saying now they prefer to go to in-person only events. They want a choice. They want a choice of attending in person or online. And I think this is a part of the new normal, and it's very significant. The third thing is, perhaps not so widely discussed, is that virtual conferences, or in future hybrid conferences, they offer more opportunities for patient inclusion. And I've spoken to a few patient groups, and they've all said exactly the same. They said, yes, this could be quite a radical breakthrough for patients and patient organizations to attend medical conferences. Now, you probably know that this whole patient participation, patient inclusion movement has been around for a long, long time. I mean, I've been involved in it for at least 12 years or so. In America, there's the Society for Participatory Medicine. Over here, there's the Patients Included movement. I was a founding signatory of this group. Basically, there's no more discussion or dispute about the value that patients can bring to conferences. So it looks as though we may be moving into a new area of significantly more patient participation at medical conferences in the future. I think it's very, very important. The fourth point is perhaps, well, perhaps or perhaps not recognized, is that the professional conference organizers, I say, have been traumatized. If you think about professional conference organizers, they traditionally have their roots in organizing physical meetings, you know, booking hotels, flights, catering, all of these sorts of things. This is where they earn their bread and butter. But all of that fell flat over the last couple of years, and many of them have gone through really quite hard financial times, and many are still suffering from that. But in parallel to that, we've seen the demand from medical societies and also the pharma industry, and I'll come to the pharma in a minute. They've seen they need more specialized support from PCOs and also their technology partners. So the sorts of things they're now looking for, where the PCOs are providing very specialist expertise. I mean, I've got a long list of things here, like speaker training, cloud infrastructure, online platforms, video management, analytics, customer journey mapping, personalization modeling, AI-assisted personalization, yeah, and effective medical education techniques. And in addition to that, I think there are many more opportunities now for PCOs to provide more long-term strategic guidance. Things are changing. I think there's a new normal, and I think PCOs have an opportunity here to work much, much closer with medical societies, and I think also with the pharma industry, on shaping that future. And a lot more thinking has to go into the strategy rather than just thinking about the tactics all the time. The next point, hotly debated. I called it originally hybrid. I thought originally hybrid was overhyped, but I think on reflection, it's better to think about or discuss that the label hybrid, I think, is confusing. You know, we've seen over the last couple of years, a lot of talk about the transition to hybrid events in future. But I think there was very little understanding of what hybrid really meant. The definitions of hybrid have been around for a long time, at least a decade or so. But no one really understood and still understands what hybrid really stands for. Some of the descriptions are very, I think, very esoteric, very difficult to find out what they really mean. But the one thing that has emerged in discussing hybrid with a number of groups is that staging hybrid events is very difficult. You've got two infrastructures. You've got the virtual and you've got the in-person infrastructures running in parallel, which makes for huge amounts of complexity, increasing costs and organization enormously. So what I've seen is now that many of the medical societies no longer use the term hybrid. They're not really sure themselves what it should mean. So they've switched to these, in-person and on-site descriptions, which perhaps describe or give them the freedom to design these events in a way that's most suitable for themselves, in a way I think that would be most suitable for their members. And what they will ultimately be will be what their members really want. It'll be up to the members to say what they like and what they dislike. It'll be their needs, preferences, and expectations. So I think that would be it's work in progress. We'll see what hybrid really means. I mean, there has been, to my knowledge, here in Europe, only 2 major hybrid events in 2021. All the rest have been virtual. So it's been very difficult to judge, and certainly the societies that stage these 2 hybrid events have been not willing to share their members' feedback. I did try, but it wasn't possible. That didn't surprise me. So the next thing that I think is really important is that the commercial partners, and particularly the pharma industry, I mean, they've confronted a very steep learning curve. Again, for the same reason that medical societies have been disrupted. The industry's focus or its marketing focus has been traditionally on attending live events. Their internal meetings and events departments are focused on live events. It's the organization, hotels, flights, etc. So what I've seen is they are working equally closely with the PCOs and technology partners to understand what this all means. But one of the things that that really is going to be a challenge for them is that if we move to a hybrid future, and I've seen this on these 2 hybrid events that have already taken place, how complex the decision-making will actually be for the industry. I mean, if you imagine you've got the choices of a virtual exhibition stand or a face-to-face exhibition stand, and the same goes for sponsored symposia, and the choices are really quite complex. There's a difference in costs, the duration of the event, whether there are online analytics available. These are really very, very major marketing decisions for the industry, and also connected with very substantial financial obligations. So I think for the industry, they're going through an equally steep learning curve as perhaps medical societies, and what the outcomes will be, I don't know. So they're the 6 major learnings that have struck me. Those out there watching this webinar may have others, and I'd be very interested to hear if there are other opinions on this. But for me, all of these 6 learnings, these 6 lessons, have got implications for medical societies and the way they stage their events in future. And I've called them really, these are new conference attributes. And I think for each individual attributes, there are things that the industry should be doing. And I've sort of listed, I'm going to have to return to my notes here to remember I've got to include them all. But I think there's some measures, I mean, that's an understatement perhaps, of what societies need to do to thrive in the new normal. And it goes in no particular order again. I think they have to more closely monitor their members' needs, preferences, and expectations. They will probably need to boost their internal capabilities to deal with and to orchestrate the coordination with the PCOs. They will need to use more PCOs who have proven expertise, I think, in strategy and tactics. They'll have to create a patient-inclusive culture. It won't be quite so easy. They'll have to develop more sustainable business models to reflect the online and the offline worlds. And they'll have to innovate and experiment. And the one thing that I've not yet mentioned is that they will have to improve the standards of medical education. One of the things that's also been discovered is that medical conferences as such, passive presentations with very little opportunity for discussion and Q&A is not really the best learning format. And there's been a lot of discussion about what these new formats can be really entail. So that in a nutshell is where I am today. So I'd really welcome questions or comments.
Excellent. Okay, and thanks, Len. That's and we've talked about this before. I mean, those 6 points, we could probably spend an hour on each of those 6 points and more, sort of thing. There's an awful lot to be covered within there, and all we can do on an occasion like this is raise some of this and try and get some discussion and maybe help people think about these issues. But there's some really quite deep questions in there, and I'm also going to address the elephant in the room a little bit, and state an obvious point here, which we're talking about what medical societies are doing. And the honest truth is, none of the 3 of us run medical societies, or why can't we get medical society medical society organisers on here, Peter? And the truth is, I've tried and not got very far. To ask a blunt question, Len? I mean, you talk lots to the societies. You've been trying to track what they're doing. Without putting words in your mouth, how helpful have they been to you in terms of providing the evidence of what's happening?
The answer is not very. I did reach out to I have reached out to a number over the last few months, but I think for the reasons I've already stated, they're not really willing to make public statements about what their intentions are right now, which I understand.
Because there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty,
yes.
and so we're all recognizing that. But part of the frustration is, if we don't talk about it, maybe we can't learn from each other. I suppose that's where I'd be coming from, sort of thing. If we can all acknowledge that we're in a learning situation, maybe sharing some of these ideas would help. But if there's any medical society people in the audience today or watching this video later on and would like to get involved in this stuff and talk to us about what you're doing, I would love to hear from it. So I think there's a little bit of proviso on what we're talking about today. We're looking at it a little bit from a distance and speculating a little bit. I just wanted to pin you just on one quick question. You talked about a couple of hybrid events, truly hybrid events. Can you just tell us which two that we're talking about there?
Well, one is the International Society of Transplantation, and the other is almost unpronounced, but it's the European Committee of Immunology, and something else I can't remember. But these are the only 2 events that I'm aware of that were explicitly hybrid.
Okay, I just thought it was worth clarifying that, because you made the point that there's very limited. There's only a couple of them, so we might as well just share those if people want to go and look at what they've done, sort of thing. Certainly from where I sit, there's a constantly changing narrative out there. People will talk about hybrid, or they'll talk about face-to-face, and then suddenly it's virtual, or people are making this up as they go, and that must be causing all sorts of problems for the organizers that I can only imagine. Ilan, just to bring you in now and give us a sort of a 30 seconds of what GMed's about, so that we understand where you're coming from, but also talk a little bit then to the point about how you're seeing physicians learning, how you're seeing physicians wanting to communicate with each other, and specifically give us some of the headlines from your study, because you've asked some of these questions of your audience, haven't you? But to explain it, what we're talking about, and then explain what you found. You see what I mean?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Hi, everybody. I'm Ilan. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of GMed. GMed is the largest social network for physicians, global physicians. We got over 1.5 million physicians across almost 200 countries. And we are in a daily manner monitoring what physicians are saying about COVID clinically in general. Of course, about other clinical aspects, not only COVID, but during COVID, we've seen, when asking physicians and when monitoring their discussions about COVID, about conferences, we've seen very interesting trends. If you remember, physicians normally go to conferences, of course, to get to be educated, but also to meet their peers. These are great opportunities to shake hands, in between the lectures, to do networking. And once COVID came, we saw that a physician actually don't have that opportunity anymore. And virtual or hybrid, whatever it is, we are also very confused about what is hybrid. And those formats didn't give a lot of opportunity for physicians still to network, and they were looking for that networking opportunities. And in our study that we ran for 18 months, we were able to track the conferences, the preferences of physicians across different conferences, by the way, different specialties, from oncology like ESMO, ASCO, and also diabetes like ENDO. And we saw that physicians are talking about this this need to shake hands, so to speak, and do the networking. And there's some solutions for that, but I'm not sure this is the right place to speak about it, but there are solutions for how to do that networking. And our study, for example, find out that that there is still a strong preference towards hybrid and virtual. And I think most importantly, it's the non-physical conferences. By the way, when we compare it to 2020, a year ago or over a year ago, it's actually that preference even increased. It increased in about 30%. So physicians from year to year are adapting to the situation and more and more preferring the virtual and the hybrid formats. So that is certainly a trend that we see, and this is coming from, as I said, 1.5 million physicians. Even when we analyzed the preference by age, one can ask himself, okay, so maybe what will be the age group that will be that will have more preference towards a hybrid or virtual versus let's say towards physical. So we saw that that surprisingly, the young physicians preferred the physical formats, while the older physicians, the more seniors, prefer the virtual. That can be explained by the fact that maybe the younger physicians are still looking for the networking that is used to be on physical, and maybe that the more senior physicians are the ones that already got those networks and they don't need it, or maybe they got some kind of a financial toll of closing their private practice. This is that kind of information we found in our report that can be found also on our website. And happy also to discuss maybe later on, Peter, with you what we see how pharma is using the digital space for medical education. What we see that is basically the engine that behind it. How do they adapt what we see on our platform, where the budgets are going?
Okay, thanks, Ilan. Thanks. I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in. I think there's some quite interesting questions coming in here. One of the problems with this conversation, and it was picked up quite early on, and Len, you talked about it, is how are we defining hybrid? And when you're running your survey, for instance, Ilan, and you're finding out, people are, I think I'm right in saying, in summary, a majority of your audience prefers hybrid or virtual over face-to-face. That's the point. But you didn't. But just out of interest, did you define hybrid in that questionnaire, or did you leave that open to interpretation? Yeah.
No, and I think that's very interesting that you're asking. We let the physician do their own interpretation about what is hybrid. I think maybe, Len, maybe that can be a nice additional activity that we can run to ask physicians what do they think is hybrid, and maybe to check a few options. I'm not. It will be interesting to see it. Each one sees that in his own eyes, but certainly something that we can check.
I mean, I'm very public about the fact that I've hated the word hybrid for ever since it started being talked about, precisely because everyone's got their own interpretation of it, and any conversation like this is confused because we're all interpreting it in different ways, sort of thing. Sorry, Len, I cut across you. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, my comment on what you just asked there is that we were all hung up on this definition of hybrid. One of the definitions was around, well, the two audiences, the in-person and the on-site, would have equivalently good, excellent experiences and have seamless, or the options of seamless interaction with one another. Well, I think we've come a long way away from that. I'm not sure that the two audiences want seamless interaction. And the two experiences will be somewhat different. And I think what I've seen is the medical societies don't see the need to provide equal or equivalent experiences. They will be different. And that is a big difference.
And it may not be a problem. I mean,
it may not be a problem, no.
It depends on the business model, doesn't it? And again, there's some questions alluding to this. I mean, if I run a workshop, which is, or a meeting, which is basically designed around a face-to-face audience, but I give the community the option of dialing in and watching something or engaging with it or something, and make it a hybrid meeting from that point of view. But if I don't say the two experiences are the same, and I don't try and charge the same, and so they're two different sorts of meetings, then both groups of people might be very, very happy. Yeah, I mean that in principle can work. The problem comes from then their expectations. And there is an expectation, I think, amongst people that, now I can just dial into a meeting and the experience has to be as good as going face to face, and anything less than that is no good. And that's a shame, because I think that's a narrative that unfortunately we've built for ourselves by people going, we can do that, and failing to do that. But also, to come back to, again, Len's point, you're running two meetings, and however good or bad either experience is, you want it both to be good enough. And that's a lot more resource than actually just running one sort of meeting. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, sure.
And then it comes down to some of the questions that come in. It comes back to the business models. How are the organizations, the societies going to survive potentially? And it's all very well saying let's run a mixed type meeting, but if not enough people turn up to the face-to-face meeting in order to support the sort of the overall meeting, because you're going to presumably, I mean, if pharma companies start withdrawing their support for the exhibition stands physically and so on, for instance, that's a big chunk of money gone. Then it's like the people. I mean, I used to talk about the pubs around here. Lots of people want to go back to the pub, and some of them will go back to the pub. But if the pub doesn't exist because the pub's collapsed, because there isn't a business there, then it doesn't matter what your choice is, sort of thing. And I still think the economics of this are hugely, hugely important. But the anonymous said, many of the congress we attend have gone straight back to face-to-face meetings. The main barrier is the current congress business models. Can we do anything to help? What's your? I mean, and someone else was asking how many companies. Congresses are going back to face-to-face. What's your sense then? I mean, my own personal sense is everyone's actually still struggling with that, and quite a few may be going to face-to-face, but then pulling back and going, oh, let's be virtual again. But I don't know, and I'm not tracking it. What's your sense?
It's pretty clear to me that the majority of medical conferences are going for a hybrid. I use the term hybrid instead of saying online. No, that's the way they're going, because I think they have already seen that doctors do want this choice. And the studies, I mean, this large study that Ilan has just completed confirms that. And someone else I just saw wanted to know where I got some of this data about less than 50% of doctors wanting physical only conferences. One of the very first studies that was conducted by Ashfield Events. They've actually conducted two. And both of those were really quite in-depth, but nothing like so large as Ilan's study. I mean, they interviewed 300 doctors from the EU and the US once, and they did it again with a follow-up study, same number. Ilan's got, how many did you interview?
Over 1,200.
1,200, and that was global. So and they more or less confirmed one another. There were slightly more doctors in Ilan's study that actually wanted the either the virtual or the hybrid, compared with the EU and US study, which that didn't surprise me.
And by the way,
sorry again. Yeah.
So by the way, we also saw that trend in our report, in our study. Some conferences or some specialties has different preferences towards hybrid or physical or virtual. It's consistently towards the hybrid and virtual, but there is also some variation inside the conferences.
Well, I think one of the things that I expect is that we're seeing like an awful lot of effort has been put into improving the virtual experience. I mean, just every PCO that I've spoken to has told me about all the features they're trying to build in and the improvements they're making. They've had a lot of feedback, and they now know how, and they are working. Many of them have done this. They've improved the experience. So I think we might well see, as these virtual experiences improve, we might see even more doctors thinking that's the way to go in the future. And I'm leaving out all the discussion, which maybe at the end, what's going to happen, in the next few years and then leading up to 2030, and that's a whole new discussion.
We're talking a lot about hybrid and what is hybrid, but actually hybrid can really be leveraged. Think about just the option that, Len, we had a lot of discussions about the social networks and the conferences even 5 or more years ago, but just see the option which is valid right now to, if you look at what's happening right now in conferences, sometimes you have abstract sessions that are maybe just 5 minutes in physical conference, yes? 5 minutes, you got a speaker, give his 5 minutes, go down another speaker. And then you want to try to have a discussion with that physician, right? Maybe there's a question from the audience, but there's no time. And maybe that specific question can maybe leverage that abstract, right? Give the speaker maybe another angle. So it's not even possible in the physical settings, but if you look at the hybrid settings, you can take the discussion into the virtual world, into maybe social media. So you can continue the discussion in another platform, and then to increase, to do some kind of a follow-up for the whole medical education. This is how actually hybrid can leverage what we've done in physical.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a very important point, I think, Ilan. And I didn't include in my 6 points, maybe it should be included as a 7th point, about the new opportunities for using social media. I mean, Ilan, we have discussed that a lot. It has happened already. I mean, I've been talking about how social media has been used over at least the last 6 or 7 years by certainly doctor social networks quite a lot to present things like highlights. Doctors, are complaining all the time that they just don't have enough time to read or listen to stuff. So the more you condense and come to the things that are really important, things that they will remember, things that they can use, right away in their practice, and things that actually would have an impact on patient outcomes. Those things are really important. I think we have to bear in mind anything that will improve that the means of conveying these new findings and whatever the medical specialty might be, and getting them in practice is the way to go. That's what doctors really want. That's what I'm hearing. What also I think
I can, less from the society side, I can speak about our clients in the pharma industry and about advertising. Definitely we hear the voice of physicians looking at the thousands of abstracts that they got virtually, and it's very confusing. So what pharma has started doing is sponsor dedicated spaces where they can bring the highlights from that conferences. It's also on June. And then what you see from pharma is that conferences were always the center of the brand promotion, right? You want to come with the new abstracts around the conference because everybody are there. But now, when it's a virtual world, maybe you don't need to wait for the conference. Maybe it can go throughout the year, but we still see this pattern when the pharma will start with a warm-up, a bit of unbranded information, some also branded. They will use both advertising, but also they will have the ability, and this is where I'm looping back to what you said about what is important from their side, from pharma side, is the ability on the digital space to provide the information that will be visible for a long time, and then immediately also to check the implementation, to check the understanding of that piece of content that they just presented. And this is something that I think is really helpful for pharma, because until now, I don't know how successful were the digital booths and so on, but there are new opportunities also for GMED clients and in general to pharma. So education is maybe even maybe stepped up in terms of the digital space around conferences.
I think one of the things I think is interesting over the last couple of years is the change of language and the new language that's come out, and the sort of talk about asynchronous, synchronous type engagement and so on. You know, and yet the problem is we still talk about a conference and everyone thinks about a 3-day event or whatever it is. Yeah. You know, for years we've, you know, in the good old days we had a conference, but we talked about, well, let's produce the newsletter or the newspaper to have an enduring item to keep the discussion going or whatever. And you know, so we sort of were touching on that many years ago, sort of thing, the idea we want to keep the people engaged. As digital's come through, there's been more and more ways in which people can become digitally engaged. And we somehow need to get beyond the conference language, don't we? Because if we can find a different way of talking about stuff, which is just ongoing, you know, engagement with our audience, which has a mixture of, you know, synchronous and asynchronous type stuff. I don't know quite what I just suspect there'll be a different language in another year or 2 or 5 times, sort of thing, which everyone will sort of buy into. Am I making any sense there or not?
You know, I think you're right. There's been a lot of discussion about, you know, conference formats. That's not new, and these discussions are increased obviously over the last couple of years. Again, they're not new insofar as some. I mean, for example, I've looked at and been following University of California, Santa Barbara's attempts to produce these asynchronous meetings, but from the perspective of being carbon neutral. They have a model that's called the nearly carbon neutral conference model, and this was developed really about 2016 or whatever. And this is really a model that involves all the things we've been discussing, you know, with face-to-face meetings, virtual, and spread out over many months. And it also has the dimension of using different languages as well. So these types of things, and I've listed all the models that are being discussed, but I come back to the conclusion that these models are very interesting, and they certainly would, I think they would meet a lot of the demands that I've been listening to, with, you know, medical advances being communicated very quickly rather than having to wait for a whole year before an annual conference takes place. But they do involve a lot more organization and a lot more cost, of course. There's financial side of this. So what will actually happen, I'm not really certain. And I think this is where the medical societies and conference organizers need to experiment a little bit more to see whether these new formats really are worthwhile doing. And I think a lot of them, when you actually if you go into them in detail, they have ideas that you can pick and mix and match. You know, there are lots of permutations and combinations of these conference features that can be pulled together. But right now, I'm not aware of any asynchronous meetings as such taking place. All of the big meetings I see that are scheduled for this year are in virtual format, and I don't see anything yet. I mean, we're only just into February. That could still happen, but I don't see any that are asynchronous in the way that you just described.
I can tell you that a lot of the videos, by the way, are then being featured in different platforms.
Yeah.
And that's always the preference, to see something that is on demand versus the live, always.
Yeah, I obviously on demand is asynchronous as such, but I think what we're alluding to is being asynchronous insofar as one could still communicate, ask questions of a speaker or another participant. That is really one of the key problems with current formats, is that having a passive format, a speaker up front giving a lecture with just very, very limited opportunity to ask questions, is not really the best learning experience. For anyone to learn something, really to inwardly digest something, someone has got to really understand in some depth what is being said, and have an opportunity to let it sink in, discuss it with colleagues, and see whether it's really worthwhile pursuing. This is where I think it would be, that point, I think, is where medical societies have a great opportunity to experiment with different formats. And I will just add that one society that I'm aware of has already done this, and that's ECTRIMS. I can say that. ECTRIMS has been aware of the fact that it needs to improve, or it really does need to improve the learning experience, and has put a lot of effort into its last conference to do that. And they've taken improving the learning experience really quite seriously.
I've got one eye on the clock, sorry, as always, and there's quite interesting questions coming in, and we're skipping over these. I want to come back to the patient angle if I can, maybe just for the final couple of minutes. And there's a couple of questions that have come in on this front. One, anonymous, patient inclusion in medical conferences being problematic from compliance perspective. And somebody else over the other side somewhere, I've lost it, but saying, if and maybe this is directed to you, Ilan, in terms of physician platforms, is by definition that excluding the patient sort of thing. I mean, I do think the opportunity, and we talked about this 2 years ago, maybe, in some of the webinars I was running, and getting patients involved. It just seems like not just patients, but everybody. And you've said the same thing, Len. I mean, you've seen attendance from low, middle income countries. So, diversity of attendance is massively increased. But there are some problems practically, and the patients, are we going to see that sort of initial enthusiasm to embrace the patients actually closing down as we see the rules, regulations, and platforms actually starting to restrict the attendance? And will it be wrapped up with the business models, which are, this has got to work, and it's going to work on the following basis? And although it would be lovely to have everybody involved, it's not going to be everybody involved. And that's as simple as saying something like ESC last year, am I losing track of time, 2020, was free for everybody, massive opportunity, massive numbers of people, massive PR exercise in terms of everyone, but it was for free, yeah? And that wasn't going to be sustainable. So then they started putting in the prices and so on. So there's a lot of things wrapped up in that. I suppose all I'm trying to get at is, are we really going to see some sort of a bounce back, which will actually end up just restricting everybody again? Because in real life, it's not, everyone just can't be involved as easily as that. Am I making any sense there again? Len, you're looking quizzical, but am I making enough sense for you?
I'm torn on this one. One of the first reactions, obviously, is compliance, and we've heard that for a long, long time. But there is also another viewpoint that excluding patients from medical conferences today is not really appropriate. When you think about how the likes of the European Medicines Agency actually has said on its website how inputs from patients, real world patient data, is absolutely crucial. And so there are two very extreme versions here from this, and I think that it will be long term. I think it will become normal for patients and medical society representatives to attend medical society conferences. I think that's unavoidable.
The point that's being made by Anonymous very specifically is that, can we present the data on our investigational drugs as this may be perceived as pre-approval promotion? So there's a regulatory aspect of this which can't be ignored.
Yes, but the digital, again, come for help. You can have different sessions with different data sets being presented.
Okay.
So digitally, it might be even easy to be done versus the physical world. but I think that physicians will still want to, so to speak, mingle and present data for physicians in the level of physicians. And I think morally, it's important, of course, also in terms of real world data, and get the feedback of physicians, also for pharma, by the way, to have patients part of that conferencing story.
Well, I mean, one of the things that patients and patient organizations have told me is that it is important for organizations and individuals or representatives from patient organizations to attend and present. They're not just there to listen, they're also there to present. And this is really important because what they can do, they can present their experiences of being on a drug, having MS or whatever it is, and explaining to doctors what it means for them, what it means for their illness. And the patient organizations say it's very important that doctors understand what they're doing, their interventions from a patient perspective. And this is the point they take away, because this phrase shared decision making is used all the time. And shared decision making is that doctors understand what they're doing from a patient perspective, and patients understand what the doctor's doing for them from a doctor's perspective. And it's in forums like medical conferences where this exchange can take place. And that should happen more frequently. And that's why they welcome the opportunity to attend more frequently at virtual conferences. And I don't see how healthcare can avoid that.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap things up, and I'm aware that we've not addressed some of these questions that have come in, and so to the audience, please don't rush away. We've got 10 minutes. We'll carry on talking, but I'd like to wrap up the recording. But I think I'd like to just say I think we seem to have covered such a lot of ground here, and so many areas that we could have gone into more depth in. And for instance, there's a sort of an overgeneralization here. We're talking about medical societies, their congresses, but there's big international medical societies, and there's little regional groups, and there's societies, and there's little regional chapters, and and the future is obviously going to be a whole mixture of different things. So and a lot of what we've talked about applies to an event where there's a medical society involved or not. So we've covered an awful lot of ground, but I think there's been some really interesting points made in there. And a lot of it does sort of just in the end come down to, well, what is the audience going to do? And we don't really know at the moment. We've got insights, but we don't quite know. And it'll take a while for it to work itself out, whether the societies can come up with the models, or any other organizer can come up with the models that allow that much choice for everybody that everybody wants, plus also the economic model that will allow it to happen. So, okay, look, we could keep going for a lot longer. I'm going to draw the line now because unfortunately that's what we have to do today. So those of you in the audience, as I say, don't rush away. We can carry on talking for a few minutes. Huge thanks to Len and Ilan. Major point from my point of view, part of the point of these webinars is, please connect with each other. So both of you are very happy to hear from people. Reach out on LinkedIn is the easy way of doing it. Some of the people in the audience or watching the video later, please, you'll want to follow this up. Please contact these guys directly. And thank you so much for giving up your time. To those in the audience, thanks for joining in. If you're interested in what we're doing at medcomsnetworking.com, that's the place to go. And there's more webinars coming. If you're interested in what's happened before, maybe from the webinar point of view, everything's up on NetworkPharma TV. There's 400 videos now, many of them based around these sorts of webinars. Lots of resource there, and I'm always very happy to hear from anybody if I can help, or just give me some feedback. I'm always happy to hear from you. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now and just ask everybody to give a little wave and stay safe, everybody, in these rather strange times. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.